9:45 a.m. Answering the call of nature. Having dragged ourselves out of bed, we suddenly feel the pressing pangs of hunger as we wander past the kitchen. Caffeine and cornflakes would be delicious and stimulating at this juncture, but the demands of the bladder will always outgun those of the stomach, and right now it is holding us to ransom like a piss-filled terrorist. And so, off we scurry to the... well, what do you call it? The you-know-where. In English, there are many lovely synonyms for the humble toilet. The John, loo, can, bog, lav, commode, potty, shitter, urinal, latrine, privy, porcelain, head, etc. These are informal terms, even vulgar, and in British public places we're more likely to see signs for the toilet, gents, ladies, or occasionally WC, water closet. Americans, on the other hand, tend to visit bathrooms and restrooms where they neither bathe nor rest unless they suffer from narcolepsy and accidentally fall asleep in the wash basin. It seems we're happy to be vulgar among friends, but as a society our labelling is charmingly euphemistic. A large British house might have several commodes, meaning at least one will probably be kept in its own walk-in cupboard, stationed next to a sink. This little room will often be dubbed the loo, toilet, or lavatory. There's some debates, but it's plausible that these were all French words originally. Loo is the trickiest to pin down. It's possibly derived from the polite word lieu, meaning the place. French 18th century aristocrats called their toilets le lieu anglais, the English place. But loo isn't really recorded in English usage until the 1920s, so there's more likelihood of it being an abbreviation of Waterloo Cisterns, a brand frequently stamped on outdoor toilets in the early 20th century. The word toilet derives from toilette, which initially meant a medieval cloth, then a washing cloth, then it meant a room with a washing basin, and finally, only by the late 1800s, it meant a room with a commode. On a similar note, lavatory comes from laver, the French verb to wash. So weirdly, the room that hosts our toilet is not labelled accordingly. Indeed, a home with only a single commode will probably have it plumbed in next to the shower or bathtub, resulting in the room losing the name toilet, lavatory, or loo, and instead being the bathroom, because the bath somehow trumps the bog in the naming hierarchy. Surely lavatory would be much better suited, as it would be both a washing room and it contains a toilet. Strange, isn't it? I mention all of this because language is a portal to our past, even if it's not always clear. In the English-speaking West, people frequently chuck around interchangeable words for everyday things without realising that such terms were once specific in their meanings and were intimately tied up with associations of class and custom. Today, Western sanitation facilities are standardised, no matter your earning potential. But not so long ago, owning a plumbed-in toilet was a sign of wealth, and what you called it revealed the quality of your upbringing. In fact, while our sanitation facilities are increasingly homogenised and our labels for them interchangeable, the past witnessed great variability in how our ancestors dealt with their necessary evacuations. While it's true that the yuck factor is instinctively biological, and the need to jettison turds is a recurring theme in history, the key question was always, how far must one fling a poo before it's safely out of harm's way? The result was that differing eras emerged with their own unique answers to that question. And if we were planning on travelling back in history, and were desperate for the toilet, we might be better off sending our time machine back 4,000 years rather than just 300. Those 18th century Georgians may have had very lovely frocks, but they weren't opposed to tossing piss out of a window. So, as we stumble into the bathroom and perch our buttocks down on the cold loo seat, let's start with the obvious question. How old are toilets? Stone Age sanitation. Châtellerault is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, which is enormously annoying because I can never pronounce it properly. A town in modern Turkey, perhaps as early as 9,500 years ago, it's a remarkable time capsule from an epoch when our ancestors were just beginning to permanently settle down in sizable numbers. Whereas the earliest human communities were probably no bigger than 150 people, Châtellerault may have housed up to 10,000. That may not sound like much to those of us who've been to an international football match in a fully crammed stadium, but try imagining each one of those people emptying their bowels on just a single day. That's quite a turd heap to deal with, isn't it? OK, now multiply that by 365 days. Et voila! Here is the first great problem of civilization. Where do you put all the crap? In truth, the Neolithic, or New Stone Age, response at Çatalhöyük wasn't particularly sophisticated. As far as archaeological excavations can prove, the sanitation policy seems to have been one of piling any unwanted material, including manure, on landfill sites in designated courtyards near the houses. These so-called middens were seemingly levelled off from time to time, presumably to stop them turning into poo mountains, which can't have been a terribly pleasant job for whichever Muggins was handed the rake. Of course, to us, the notion of having a gaggle of closely clustered homes stood next to a putrid mound of sun-baked waste may not sound terribly hygienic, and, well, yeah, it wasn't. For various reasons, diet change, parasite harbouring livestock, poor sanitation and close human proximity, the Neolithic Revolution, often heralded as one of the greatest transitions in human history, also paradoxically led to a sizable decrease in human health. As the 19th century Victorians would later prove, urban life often wielded greater peril than the primitive nomadic wandering that went before it. Yes, there were fewer cave bears threatening to eviscerate your guts, but the bacteria and viruses were actually far more deadly. Despite this, the Neolithic experiment ploughed on, quite literally, and after embarking on an enormous European tour that traipsed westward over several millennia, the farming revolution finally rolled into the Scottish Hebrides in around 3100 BCE, and it's here that we can see familiar toilet behaviour on a much smaller scale. A magnificently preserved Neolithic village comprising only 8 stone houses, Skarabrae, on the island of Orkney, resembles the verdant abode of J.R.R. Tolkien's furry-toed hobbits, but the mounds of grassy earth that shield the buildings from the fierce Scottish winds were not always quite so postcard pretty. Originally numbering probably fewer than 100 people, the early occupants on the island had been typically lax in disposing of their waste, and massive midden piles had accumulated. But rather than getting as far away as possible from the stinking refuse, the villagers recycled their trash by utilising these heaps as organic cocoons to insulate their new homes. Though to visit them today is to be confronted with a sort of prehistoric Teletubby land, seemingly sunk below ground level, actually the houses were built on flat turf, but were deliberately stationed between large mounds of unwanted refuse, which towered either side of them. But let's not decry the primitiveness of Neolithic hygiene too hastily, for Skarabrae does seem to harbour evidence of indoor toilets that emptied into crude sewer systems. Cubicle-like cells in the corner of the homes, built over drainage channels, suggest they were distinct zones for doing one's business, and perhaps this is also an intriguing insight into Stone Age notions of privacy. Maybe they were like us and preferred to do their business without an audience, or maybe it was simply easier to keep out smells if the toilet could be cordoned off from the living room. What's more clear is that the lack of running water suggests that when it came to cleansing their mucky backsides, the inhabitants were wipers rather than washers, with most archaeologists theorising that moss, seaweed or leaves were the Stone Age equivalent of our loo roll. So the Neolithic was the pilot programme for urban living, a flawed early blueprint for future generations to remodel, and, true enough, the Bronze Age delivered on its promise with the vastly improved version 2.0. City shitters. Imagine the scenario. A person has been busy at work when suddenly their stomach contracts and their bowels loosen. Oh, they must have eaten something dodgy. Desperate, they drop everything and run into the bathroom, pulling down their pants to plonk their cheeks down on the seat. Relaxing, their bowels empty into the toilet below, and they exhale in relief as the threat of a messy accident evaporates away. Their business done, they reach for some wiping material, clean up behind, and drop it down the hole before flushing it away with a brief torrent of water. As they wash their hands, they relax in the knowledge that their turd will be carried far from their home by the sewers. How much of this sounds familiar? A toilet with a seat, wiping material, water to flush away the turd, sewers. You might confidently assume we're dealing with a 20th century arrangement here, but perhaps you'd plump for 19th century to be safe. Well, you'd be out by about 4,500 years. What I was describing was the sanitation system in Bronze Age Pakistan. Located in the Indus River Valley and sprawling out through the northwestern part of the Indian continent, the cities of the advanced Harappan civilization were first founded in around 2600 BCE. Subsequently named after the first of these cities to be archaeologically excavated, the Harappans were obsessed with cleanliness and banished their unwanted effluent via a network of pipes that linked homes to purpose-built cesspits. The more affluent houses even had toilets, separate from bathing areas, which were simple but effective in design. A seat was positioned over a chute that led directly to the sewers, and dirty bathwater was sluiced down after each toilet visit as a sort of manual flush. Though not everyone could afford such elaborate bogs, and lower status people probably squatted over a sunken jar that would need regular emptying, at least its contents could be slung unceremoniously into the cesspit, rather than piled in next door's garden like some sort of fecal art installation. Hopefully, you'll have noticed that I've mentioned toilet seats. Yes, it's thanks to the Harappans that people first began to avoid squatting over the toilet like a sumo wrestler, although it's thought that around the same time the ancient Egyptian upper classes also parked their bums on U-shaped, stone-carved loo seats. Fans of Neolithic middens, however, will be delighted to learn that, despite such inventiveness, the Bronze Age didn't entirely do away with piles of poo, at least not in poorer areas of Egypt, where domestic waste was simply dumped outside the house to bake in the burning Saharan heat. Though this sounds wholly unhygienic, it was rather more pragmatic. Manure was a useful fertiliser that could occasionally be added into ingredients of adobe mud bricks, and it was commonly mixed with straw to be turned into winter fuel for heating and cooking. Presumably this gave dinner a certain unwanted tang, but let's try not to think about it too much. Of course, on this modern Saturday morning we enter our own bathroom and have to decide whether to stand or sit while we drain our bladder. Usually this depends on whether it's a number 1 or number 2. But it might also be influenced by our gender. In Britain, at least, blokes tend to pee standing up. Yet the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who may have visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, intriguingly suggested that Egyptian women urinated while upright, and it was men who sat down to piddle. In truth, this is an example lifted from a whole paragraph detailing the weird otherness of Egyptians compared to Greeks, so it might be an illustrative exaggeration. But his observations on privacy are interesting. And he says, "Their homes they use for defecating in, while the streets outside are where they eat. This on the principle that anything which is embarrassing but unavoidable should be done behind closed doors, while anything that is not a cause of shame should be done fully in public." If true, such modesty sounds familiar to our sensibilities, and the timidity around public pant-dropping was also shared by the ancient Jews, who placed a tremendous emphasis on spiritual cleanliness through physical hygiene. For example, it's still forbidden for Orthodox Jews to ponder the Torah's teachings or utter the sacred prayer of Shema while on a toilet or even facing a toilet. The Encyclopedia Talmudica helpfully suggests thinking of one's finances instead, except on the Sabbath day, when this is also forbidden, in which case one should think of beautiful art. More crucially, the treatment of feces and urine is carefully legislated for in Deuteronomy 23:12-14, which declares, "Designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourself. As part of your equipment, have something to dig with, and when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement." Was this a hygienic response to the threat of disease? Well, actually, it was more a case of religious courtesy. Again, the quote says, "For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy, so that he will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you." God may be all-seeing, but it doesn't mean he wants to see it all. This fastidious waste management was impressive in theory, but didn't always come good in practice. In the Middle Ages, Old Jerusalem had an entrance and exit point unromantically monikered the Dung Gate, or Sha'al HaAshpot. through which waste was hauled out of the city and burned, or piled up into a dunghill. But it wasn't just the Jews who struggled to reach their own exalted standards. When we think of ancient Athens with its marble temples and robed philosophers, it's easy to fall for the myth of classical sophistication, but that is perhaps a lavender-scented view of the past. Potties, playwrights and philosophers. Blepyrus awakes in the night needing to have a poo, but after looking around the room it suddenly dawns on him that his wife is missing, and so are his clothes. The cheeky minx has stolen them in order to pass herself off as a man. Old Blepyrus is forced to throw on her clothes and slippers instead, before stumbling out into the street to do his business. After a quick check to see if the coast is clear, he squats down outside his house and is about to empty his bowels when, unfortunately, a nosy neighbour spots him and demands to know what he's playing at. An embarrassed Blepyrus is forced to explain both his cross-dressing and the public defecation, saying, "As I urgently needed to crap, I popped my feet into these slippers so as to not soil my brand new blanket." Poor fella. It's really not the best start to the day, is it? Still, there's no need to cringe too much, as Blepyrus was merely a character in Women in the Assembly, a comic play by the great Aristophanes, for whom toilets were the joke that kept on giving. But his fictional existence doesn't mean Blepyrus wasn't a mirror to the realities of Athenian society. While the ancient Greeks are often upheld as the glorious champions of civilization, they weren't a patch on the Harappans when it came to public sanitation infrastructure. The closest mention we get to a designated defecation space is perhaps with the description by the philosopher Theophrastus of his stock idiot, a man who goes for a midnight poo in the garden outhouse and trips over the neighbour's ferocious dog. But for most it seems chamber pots were the go-to solution. Men peed in one called an amis, whereas women got their own bowl-shaped one called a scaphion. Oddly enough, scaphion was also a Greek word for a style of Beatles-esque bowl haircut, which suggests potties were upturned onto heads by overzealous barbers short of equipment. One really hopes they were scrubbed clean first. Of course, most of us only use potties when we're bawling toddlers, and the Greeks, like us, had a clever bit of kit to handle this dinky demographic. They plonked their babies in high chairs, with specially cut holes for their chunky little legs to slide through, and a hole in the seat for any inevitable waste to drop down into a scaphion below. All this domestic mess, from baby and adult, was commonly tipped into the cesspit, or copron, which was emptied by a professional waste disposers called coprologoi, who sold it to farmers for fertiliser. This arrangement sounds perfectly sensible, but what happened if a Greek was caught short away from the home? You and I could probably duck into a public lavatory, maybe one in a shop or a park, but no such things existed in Greece. The 7th century BCE poet Hesiod wrote that it was bad form to urinate outdoors, as it disrespected the notoriously tetchy gods. In Hesiod's opinion, weeing on roads, near roads, while facing the sun, or during the night, was tantamount to swaggering assertively up to the all-powerful deities and then pissing on their shoes. It seems, then, that many Greeks tried to hold it in. In fact, such stoicism was common enough to become a matter of medical curiosity. A scribbled afterthought on the back of a medical papyrus, written by a chap called Anonymous Londinensis, ponders, "For those who are caught short, if they hold it in for some time, either they can no longer poo, when they get somewhere suitable, or else manage only a small and dry poo. Why is that?" But if someone was utterly bursting for an alfresco evacuation, then dawn and dusk were the best times to go, the gods being particularly fond of the night time, and care had to be taken not to flash too much flesh. The fact that Hesiod felt compelled to write such advice suggests it was fairly common to publicly behold bare buttocks and tinkling todgers, and the glamorous uber-jerk Alcibiades, who was famed for his arrogant ostentation, was even said to have begun a fashion for openly pissing in polite company. The poets Eupolis and Epicrates of Ambracia both mention slave boys scurrying into the midst of drunken aristocratic parties with chamber pot in hand. But was piddling and pooing separate? Certainly British men in modern pubs are comfortable urinating side by side, but we vanish into secret cubicles for a number 2. Were the Greeks the same? We're not sure. But it seems the Romans were much less ashamed of their bodily functions, Indeed, for them a trip to the toilet could be something of a social occasion. When in Rome. Roman public bogs, or forica, were open rooms where people, possibly of mixed genders, sat side by side on long benches and gossiped politely while they emptied their bowels into the sewers below. Being a Briton for whom even eye contact on a tube train is unbearably intrusive, this fills me with mortifying dread. But the Romans were clearly not perturbed. Their capital city alone hosted 144 of these public establishments, all of them festooned with a parade of buttocks, and many more sprung up across the empire as well. At Apamea in Syria, a super latrine welcomed about 80 people at a time, though elsewhere the norm appears to have been closer to a dirty dozen. Wash basins and gently tinkling fountains were likely installed in the corner of the forica, and an interior channel of water ran around the edge of the floor to ensure basic hygiene. It's also hard to know just how well lit these rooms were, particularly as some were windowless, so perhaps a shadowy gloom helped keep things more anonymous. But, conversely, decorative art might also adorn the walls, perhaps as a means to distract the self-conscious pooper from the inevitable sound of straining, or maybe simply to beautify this noble public edifice. In any case, you don't paint a wall if it's too murky to see it, so visibility wasn't at zero. At Ostia Antica, one communal bog housed in the Room of the Seven Sages boasted a beautiful mural of Greek philosophers sitting around discussing their bowel movements. Various comedy captions are added, including, "The cunning Chilon taught how to fart unnoticed." Was this a jovial way to acknowledge the echoey orchestra of a dozen trumpeting anuses? Or was it a coded message, subtly demanding modesty and consideration for others? It does seem that squeezing it out, rather than holding it all in, was the usual custom, and if things weren't proceeding smoothly, then the answer was to grit one's teeth and redouble one's efforts. At Ostia, another caption says, "Thales recommended that those who defecate with difficulty should strain." With many people probably taking his advice, it seems chit-chat and the sound of splashing water would have been necessary distractions from the guttural exertions of the chronically constipated. But there would have been nothing anyone could have done about the stench rising up from the open sewers below. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the public toilet tradition was the wiping of the backside. It wasn't just the toilets that were shared, but the bum fodder too. While archaeological explorations of ancient sewers show up a lot of soiled rags, the written sources from the era speak of a sponge on the end of a stick, or xylospongion, that was passed around between the users. It was probably washed in the water channel running around the floor's perimeter, and was kept in a vase of vinegar wine to reduce the smell, but it can't have been terribly hygienic. In one particularly alarming story, the philosopher Seneca tells of a German gladiator who, rather than be forced to fight in the arena, fled into the toilets and deliberately choked himself to death on this shitty sponge. He was not the only tragic victim of Roman sanitation. There had also been a high suicide rate amongst the workers forced to build Rome's massive civic sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, during the reign of the very early Roman king Tarquinius Superbus in around 500 BCE. The job was so horribly arduous that the labourers resorted to fleeing or even killing themselves, forcing the king to use the threat of crucifixion to get them back on the job, because the only thing worse than a quick death is a slow one. Understandably, the tyrannical Tarquinius was soon overthrown and replaced with the famed Roman Republic, which itself was later replaced by the Empire in the reign of Caesar Augustus. During this largely peaceful reign, Caesar Augustus, or rather his right-hand man, Agrippa, greatly expanded the Cloaca Maxima into 7 tributary branches, leading off a central conduit, with the whole network being so magnificent in scale that Agrippa was able to row a boat through the sewers during his inspections, like some sort of subterranean gondolier floating on a river of turds. Although the sewers might have been a glorious example of Roman engineering, they weren't freely available to all. Access was only open to fee payers, which meant that the majority of the poor might only make contributions to this underground tide of effluent from the seat of the public toilets, the forica, and not from the comfort of their own homes. Indeed, like the Greeks, domestic toilet needs were largely catered for by chamber pots. Those minted with cash might have had an individual latrine in the home, but they'd still be the proud owner of a pimped-out potty, befitting their status. According to his detractors, Mark Antony's was made of solid gold, while others were encrusted with jewels, showing that even attending to the body's most basic functions could still be an excuse to show off. For the lowly masses, chamber pots were commonly emptied onto the streets, sometimes even out of windows onto the unfortunate bystanders below, and, like the Greek koprologoi, a professional class of manure and urine dealers made good money by collecting the public's potty contents and flogging it to farmers and fullers for fertilising crops and dyeing cloth. In fact, such was the profit in this trade that Emperor Vespasian, a notoriously penny-pinching ruler, gleefully boasted about how he could produce good, clean cash from taxing human waste. He was quite literally taking the piss. Bum fodder. And now for an authentic medieval joke. What's the cleanest leaf in the forest? Holly, because no one dares wipe his arse on it. In terms of toilet history, humanity peaked way too soon. It was mostly downhill after the Indus Harappans, although a decent standard of hygiene was still maintained in the orbit of the ancient Mediterranean superpowers. Yet when the overstretched Western Roman Empire dramatically collapsed in the late 5th century, the quality of plumbing mostly went with it. This early medieval period is often characterised as a brutal, backwards world of murder, rape and gullible idiocy, which isn't a fair assessment. But it's not all that easy to defend its standards of hygiene. There were no more flowing fountains, public loos or sponges on sticks. The Vikings defecated mostly in their back gardens, and were much more likely to wipe their backsides with clumps of wool, leaves, moss and seaweed. Intriguingly, though Islam took hygiene very seriously indeed, and washing would ensure no filth remained after a trip to the loo, a quotation ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad says that if the anus were to be scraped clean with pebbles, then an odd number had to be used, suggesting that the early Arabs might have used stone scrapers as bum wipers. Given the discomfort this might have caused, I would probably have plumped for 1 pebble rather than 3, but that's just me. Anyway, as we sit on our loo to perform our morning necessities, nearby there is a roll of toilet paper awaiting its big moment. Seeing as the Egyptians wrote on papyrus and the Romans had scrolls, you might justifiably wonder if medieval people had access to low-quality wiping paper. Well, not in Europe, no. But in China, quite probably. Paper was possibly in use as early as the 2nd century BCE. But the classical legend is that in 105 CE, barely 25 years after the Roman Colosseum had opened its doors, a Chinese court eunuch called Cai Lun embarked on a quest to produce a quality writing material. His experiments were pretty odd, as they saw him endlessly pulping whatever random stuff he happened to wander past. Basically, Cai Lun's ceaseless curiosity was the ancient equivalent of when we buy a new kitchen blender and spend several wide-eyed minutes wondrously slicing up assorted things found on the nearest table. I wonder if it does turnips. It does! What about pineapples? Oh, it's broken. After some dogged experimentation, Cai Lun finally hit upon a strange but reliable combination. Paper could be made by mashing up mulberry tree bark, fishing nets, and cloth rags. So, is toilet paper nearly 2,000 years old? Not quite. His goal had been to create writing stationery, not bum fodder, and the earliest verifiable references to its hygienic uses were only recorded by travellers in the 9th century. Paper was apparently brought from China to nearby Japan in the early 7th century, but it seems the Japanese had no intention of using it on their posteriors. They preferred seaweed or a wooden scraping stick called a chugi, and archaeologists have found plenty of these in medieval castle sites. What's more, while most Japanese squatted over a cesspit, a 9th century loo found by archaeologists at Akita Castle in Tohoku seems to have comprised 2 wooden boards, rather than the Bronze Age U-shaped seat, and these were built over a runoff channel that led to the castle moat. While it's not 100% proven, the fact that the old Japanese word for toilet is kawaya, which means river house, does suggest toilets could sometimes be stationed near water. Whatever you do, don't fall in the cesspit. The Japanese were not alone in dumping their ordure into water. In late medieval England, London Bridge famously had public toilets built along its length, so that Every time someone took a dump, the offending turd would plummet gracefully into the River Thames below, or, equally commonly, onto the head of some unsuspecting boatman pootling up the river. This might not sound pleasant, but it kept the bridge smelling relatively fresh, as no sewers or cesspits were required, and the Thames dispatched the excrement away from the city. Dumping waste into a fast-flowing river was a sensible option, as it didn't pollute the water supply or lead to stinking, stagnant pools. But the practice was not without some drawbacks. Monasteries, for example, commonly built their loos to flow into nearby rivers and streams, but the seasonal flooding had the nasty habit of forcing the sewage back up from whence it came. Urban citizens, on the other hand, seem to have been rather fond of a bit of weekend DIY, as there are many medieval references to people trying to bodge their own domestic plumbing solutions, such as connecting their privies to rain gutters or cheekily diverting their waste onto other people's land. Civic authorities were often quick to punish them. It's a myth that medieval urban sanitation was unregulated and chaotic, but even if they dodged a fine, these cheaters often got their comeuppance when the pipe clogged and the malodorous excrement poured back into their houses. Still, if being up to your ankles in feces sounds unappealing, spare a thought for the tiny minority who very occasionally found their whole bodies caked in human filth. These might include besieging soldiers, like those who snuck into Chateau Gaillard in 1203 by clambering up the brown-stained toilet chutes, or the Shawshank Redemption-style escape from the 11th century aristocrat Gerald of Wales, who was forced to flee to safety from Kilgarran Castle by sliding down the toilet chute and crawling out through the cesspit. Still, at least these guys made it out alive. Those who cleaned the cesspits were known as gong farmers, and it was such a disgusting job that these men were only allowed to work while others slept. For obvious reasons, they were handsomely paid for the hardship, but this didn't mean they were respected. Gong